The law can limit contractual freedom by prohibiting certain kinds of contracts. Thus, federal law prohibits the sale of human organs. These laws that limit freedom of contract create inalienable rights and duties. The law can also limit contractual freedom by prohibiting certain terms in agreement. These laws create mandatory or immutable rules. Mandatory rules, for example, prohibit unconscionable terms or place mandatory ceilings on the amount of liquidated damages. There is a surprising consensus among academics that there are only two normative justifications for restricting freedom of contract. Put most simply, immutable rules are justifiable if society wants to protect parties within the contract or parties outside the contract. The former justification turns on paternalism, the latter on externalities. Immutable rules limit freedom of contract, and this limitation is justified only if unregulated contracting would be socially deleterious because parties internal or external to the contract cannot adequately protect themselves. For example, we prohibit willing contractors from agreeing to pollute or agreeing to assassinate the governor because of the negative third-party effects. In contrast, we prohibit infants from entering contracts because of paternalism concerns. Both paternalism and externality concerns are concerns about the inadequacy of consent. The externality concern is the concern that third parties haven't had the opportunity to consent or withhold their consent to the transaction. The paternalism concern is the concern that one of the nominal parties to the contract does not have the capacity to provide informed consent. Some mandatory limitations may be motivated by a mixture of externality and paternalism concerns. For example, federal law now prohibits prepayment penalties in certain mortgages. This mandatory limitation might be motivated by a concern with the negative social consequences seen in recent housing crises, as well as by a concern that individual borrowers are not adequately informed about the potential problem that such prepayment penalties can produce, for example, in trying to refinance their home. So, if you encounter a rule that is mandatory, you should ask yourself whether the rule can be justified by paternalism or by externality concerns. The distinction is important because there are different potential solutions to these two different concerns. Externality concerns might be alternatively solved by giving third parties a right to veto contracts that adversely affect them. Veto rights effectively make the affected parties internal to the contract, so there's no longer an externality concern. In contrast, paternalism concerns might be assuaged by improving the ability of existing contractors to protect themselves, rather than by extinguishing their contractual freedoms. Libertarians are particularly suspicious of paternalism justifications, because it might be more appropriate to preserve contractual freedom by providing the private parties with better information about the consequences of their decisions, decision-making than by eliminating their autonomy to consent to contracts of their choosing. Should the law enforce an agreement between heterosexual spouses entered into at the time of marriage in which the woman spouse promises to notify the male spouse of any pregnancy and or of her intention to have an abortion, unless the woman in good faith believes that such notification would subject the woman to a risk of psychological or physical harm? If you believe that such an agreement should not be enforceable, is this restriction on women's contractual freedom best justified by paternalism or externality concerns?